got a few slides and some insights just to share with you on the topic of hotel brands and, frankly, what's the point? I am going to start back in 1995 when our hotel guest survey looked a bit like that. It weighed a ton, and if you can just see handwritten on there, you have CT office copy. Now, I did see, Chris, is he still in here? There he is, there's CT. So this was your office copy that I salvaged when we moved out of Kingsbourne House during the pandemic. And back then, as I'm sure you remember, Chris, we tracked about 45 hotel brands, which at that point was pretty much every brand that was around. What we also did was we asked people, business travelers and leisure travelers, we separated out the samples at that point, how they booked and researched their hotels back then. And there's two things to call out on this slide. One is you can see the growth in travel and hotel agents in just 1 year. So even back then, people were looking to save energy and save effort and save time when selecting hotels. But what you might have noticed is the total absence of something that is now universal on this slide. It wasn't even tracked. And we didn't track it for another couple of years when it all looked a little bit like this. World-leading sites there, one in particular stands out for me. Any internet, 2% in 1997, 2% of business travelers researched hotels using the internet in 1997. And just 8 years later, it had overtaken guides and handbooks. And much like the slide that Andrew showed, where the jobs in elevators just disappeared down to zero, well, such happened to printed guides and handbooks in that time. When we stopped the question in this form in 2017, it was 4 in 5, it was almost universal. We don't even bother asking now, there's just no other way. If we fast forward, though, to 2024, we are now tracking 166 brands in the Hotel Guest Survey, and that is excluding peer-to-peer accommodation, that's excluding intermediaries and booking channels. These are just hotel brands, and that is not exhaustive. We have to go through that list every year and decide what stays, what goes, what gets added, and what doesn't. So from 48 and a total market view to 166, it's been rapid growth. We all know why. We don't need to go over the drivers on the demand side and the supply side. That's been well covered. But there are two questions that just don't go away. They don't appear either. There we go. Do we have too many brands? And what's the point of having a brand these days? So shall we start with the first one? Who here thinks we have too many hotel brands? Show of hands, please. Okay, I would say that it's about a third, maybe a quarter of people think we have too many hotel brands. I'm in agreement with the majority here. And the reason is I can understand why people would think there are too many. There are certainly too many from an investment point of view if you are trying to make a rational decision, even from a purchasing point of view. If you are trying to make a rational decision where you are weighing up the pros and cons of everything, there's far too much. There's far too much mental load. There's far too much ability to sort of get bogged down in choice paralysis. But in a world where people want differentiation, people want unique experiences, some people want what a brand used to be, which is consistency all over the world, but most people want individualization. I don't think we do have too many brands, and we can just see that by the sheer force of the market and what's happening. It brings us, though, to the second question, which is, what's the point of having a brand these days? And for that, I'm going to hand over to Ted.
Thanks, James. So if I think about what James and his team, some of whom are here, they're really the advocates for the consumer voice. What are we liking about customer experience? Where are we staying, et cetera? And I think about my team as behavioral scientists to be more advocates for the consumer brains, what they can't even necessarily tell you through research, but what might be behind some of their behaviors and some of their responses. So what is a hotel brand? Of course, for many of you, it's an operational, financial, legal point of view, right? It's an entity you pay a service fee to, et cetera, et cetera. But from the consumer point of view, it's really just a perceptual construct. Is Harrods nicer than Harvey Nichols? Is John Lewis, as nice as Selfridges. Brands are a perceptual construct, and they only mean something within kind of a cultural context. John Lewis means nothing in France and Portugal. Harrods means nothing in Western Texas, right? So that these brands have meaning within a context. The interesting about hotel brands is that they're one of the experiential brands that are truly international, but they still have a different relationship in people's minds depending on the construct that they have and depending on the jobs to be done, which we'll talk about in a minute. However, it's really important about how it influences people during the decision path of which hotel they're going to stay at. Because there are, I'd argue, in a lot of places, just too many hotels. You'd say maybe not, they need to build more from a full room capacity, but from the brain capacity, we can't make sense of it. So what then is the point? Well, the reality is that brands convey some kind of purchase considerations that maybe people can't rank or rate, or to James's point, we're just not that rational. We don't make rational decisions even when we're booking a hotel room for a business trip with a specified amount of budget. We still make some trade-offs, and brand is oftentimes that mental shortcut to say, yes, I would feel comfortable staying in a Pullman. I believe they will have good Wi-Fi. I believe that there's a restaurant where I can take a meeting there, et cetera, right? Not all Pullmans, I assume, are the same. Not all the staff and all the experience are the same. And yet the brand makes this mental shortcut for me, because some of these things vary in importance depending on the type of stay and depending on the type of guest, but they all contribute to this kind of cognitive load that James talks about in terms of how the decision is made. So what is the point of having a hotel brand these days? From a cognitive perspective and the way that it works in the brain, it does two things. One, it helps drive selection amongst all the clutter of all the other hotels. And secondly, it helps you to increase a premium per guest room. So thinking about driving selection, price alone doesn't really give us enough data to make a kind of complete picture of where we want to stay. I was in Chicago in October, so I just did a screen capture. I'm American, so I know Chicago quite well, but imagine you haven't been to Chicago, or you're booking for one of your colleagues who hasn't been, and you look at this and you go, okay, so there's something hiding up there near the Oak Street Beach, which is 610 pounds a night. That seems pretty expensive. A lot of things seem to be around 200 pounds a night. Okay, there's something down there south. What does this tell me? It tells me a little bit of where there's a concentration of some high-end hotels, but it doesn't really tell me much about the stay, the neighborhood, the experience that I might have. Brands help guests truly picture their stay, so I've just chosen some of the hotels here. So if I see there's a Waldorf Astoria, there's a Ritz-Carlton, there's a Park Hyatt, all in that neighborhood, I'm starting to get a picture of what that neighborhood might be like, what kind of restaurant, what type of retail might be around there. But then I also see there's a W. So then we think about what are these kind of qualitative measures that people are using to make their choice about the hotel. And so maybe it's something like cultural alignment or safety and security or navigational support. Maybe I know that I will be entertaining other out-of-town guests on this business trip, and I want to make sure that the concierge or some service in this hotel can give me really great directions and plan things for us. Or it's cultural alignment. I'm going to be having guests who are Muslim and don't eat pork. I have a sense that if there's a Jumeirah hotel, they'll be able to cater for all of that easily. Or I want to stay at the W because I think they'll have a point of view on getting into Chicago's music scene, right? That concierge or that service will somehow be different. So these different factors that people don't necessarily articulate, the brand becomes the shortcut for that. Waldorf Astoria is classic luxury. W is a bit funky. It has a bit of a sense of the city. It has a bit of youth about it. There's probably a spa, etc. So it becomes this quite shorthand way for people to navigate a new destination. I chose Chicago. I could have said Boston or Bratislava or Bangkok, right? What you have to keep in mind also is that the brain is constantly trying to filter down. I talk to clients in the shopper world. If you entered a supermarket or a hypermarket, there's probably 200,000 different products and variants in there. Your brain can't rationally go through and eliminate the products that you don't need. I don't have children. I don't need diapers and nappies. I don't need baby formula. I don't need pet food, right? The brain is doing the same even with hotels. And interestingly, we don't have particularly well-entrenched habits because we're not booking hotels every week the way that we're probably doing a weekly shop. So the brand becomes this quick mental shortcut. I happen to be a Marriott guy. I lived in Asia for a long time. Starwood and Marriott were quite strong in Asia. Now, when I'm going to a new city, I'm going to Lisbon for a conference, my first thing is just to look through the Marriott app. I'm not particularly loyal to Marriott. I'm not, no offense if anybody here works for a Marriott group, I'm not like a huge lover of Marriott, but it becomes the way for me to shorten down the list of all the hotels in Lisbon. That's what the brain is asking us to do, and brands help us do that. Secondly is around how do you increase a premium kind of per guest, per stay through a brand. If you take it away from hotels and, I don't know, Fiona's going to be cooking some coq au vin, she's probably going to buy quite a cheap red wine. If she's just having wine with her partner tonight for dinner, she'll maybe buy a kind of mid-tier wine. If her partner's parents are coming over for dinner at the weekend, she's probably going to buy a slightly higher-end bottle of wine. It's still all red wine, but the job to be done by that wine is very different. And so Fiona, same exact consumer, makes very different choices depending on the job to be done. And hotels work the same in the brain when we look at how people go through the booking process. What do I want to accomplish in that stay? What needs to be done? What needs to be covered? You know, so maybe you have a guest who says, oh, geez, I haven't really gone abroad since COVID. Of course, price matters, but I want to stay somewhere with reliable service and kind of a proactive staff. I want to feel comfortable. Maybe this is an American guest of a certain age, and he says, okay, so there's a Holiday Inn in Phuket. I want to stay at a Holiday Inn because I have a level of service expectation, hygiene, etc. Another guest says, I'm going to propose on this trip, right? I'm taking Louise to Hanoi and I want to propose to her, so I want a hotel that I can trust to really make it special and memorable. That could lead into kind of ideas of luxury or also ideas of privacy or ideas of, you know, food and beverage, etc. So kind of a prestige driver and a prestige job to be done. Or another guest who says, I need this meeting to go well. There's plenty of places I can book a conference room at a co-working space at any hotel, but I can't afford to make any mistakes, no last minute surprises, so I'd feel really comfortable booking a conferencing room at the Hilton because I've attended a meeting there before and everything was perfect, right? So again, people are willing to trade up for the right job to be done, and a brand again becomes that mental shortcut to say, Hiltons are strong at conferencing, or Holiday Inn, I'll feel like the service level would be good enough, or I want to take Louise to a Rosewood because I think it's going to be so special and romantic and I know that they'll pull out all the stops for my proposal. So these two things are ways in which affect the booking journey, which is no big surprise, but what it's doing to the brain is really about choice selection and what we call choice architecture, limiting choice, and then ascribing value so that you can kind of understand what kind of guest is in this market and what brand fits this market. This comes from a survey that Fiona runs called the Hotel Guest Survey at BVA BDRC, and when we ask people explicitly about brand, you can see that only kind of three factors that add up to about 9% of the average selection decision are influenced by brand explicitly when you ask them how much did the brand matter. So you think, okay, well, brand doesn't matter that much. But when you take into account some of those other factors that are influenced by brand, value for money, my perception of value for money, is it comfortable, well-equipped bedrooms where I can truly relax? Is sanitation and safety at a high standard? Are the food and beverage offerings good? Brand, again, becomes shortcut for some of these other factors that truly influence people's selection criteria. And when you add that all up together, it's actually about 53% of those decision criteria into choosing which hotel to stay at. So again, brand explicitly becomes more of a shortcut, but brand implicitly has quite a big impact on decision making. James, I'll pass it back to you. Yeah, of course.
I'm just wondering, I mean, I've always worked for the big brands, so I follow the logic. What I don't get at the moment anymore, we are hotel specialists. Thank you. We even cannot really distinguish between the brands anymore. If you would ask me today the difference between, and again, this is also not against Marriott, what's the difference between a Marriott and a Sheraton? For me, it's the carpet, nothing else. And the things, I think there are more like these brands. So when I look at your, the example you gave about Chicago, do we really believe that all the customers will know the difference between a JW, Marriott, a W Hotel, etc.? So this is coming back to the first question, do we need more brands? Yeah. And I said no, because I don't think we can distinguish anymore.
And I don't think that we're arguing that there needs to be more brands. Far from it. However, the existing brands do, again, from a certain cultural context, do mean something. I agree with you. To me, the difference between a Marriott and a Sheraton is somewhat negotiable. But I think the difference between a Park Hyatt and a W is very distinctive to me. And so I think, again, that's influenced somewhat on the market that you've been in and where you're kind of saturated with hotels. Like, we work for a French company. I'm learning now about the differentiations between some of the Accor brands because I tend to be in France a bit more. But they don't instinctively, intuitively have meaning, but they have meaning if you've stayed at one, if you've grown up in a market where they have meaning. But I agree, there's so many, and with a merger like Starwood and Marriott, I think they've ended up with some brands that were clear direct competitors, and for legacy reasons, they're not willing to delist them. So I don't think our argument is that there should be more brands, but our argument is that brands do have an impact on the selection process because brands have some meaning on a consumer psychology.
My argument is not that there should be more brands. My argument is that there will be more brands, and there's not a lot we can do about it. And it's because people want these differentiated experiences, and it's because if you remember that early chart I showed you, we had 45 brands, and then we had 166 brands. As well as all that choice in brands, there's now the intermediary channels that didn't exist. So it is perfectly possible to go through your life as a hotel traveller and not be exposed to some of the brands that we would consider to be the establishment. In fact, we see that when we look at the awareness levels of the top 10 brands in the UK over the last 7, 8 years now. There are 5 in that top 10 who over the last 6 years have seen their awareness drop consistently year on year on year on year on year. And the reason for that, in one exception, but the reason for that with all of them is that they're just not getting through to younger travellers. Younger travellers are not yet becoming exposed to them because they're being presented with hundreds of choices and they're filtering down and they're not retaining it. Do the hotel brand companies expect people to understand and know and differentiate all their brands? No, I don't think they do, and I don't think they care. As long as you know one or some of their brands, they're happy. They want to reach as many people as possible. They don't need to get one core brand into everybody. And that's what's been driving the growth. It's one of the things that's been driving the growth in brands, is to make sure that there are choices, there are tools for all of the different jobs that now need doing, because people aren't just picking up a guidebook and choosing from the 4 or 5 brands that are presented to them. Once you get more choice, you expect more choice. Consumers wouldn't expect to have less variety available to them.
And I think a good way to look at it is what is the job to be done? Because I think kind of classical research segmentation of hotel guests would kind of say, this is our luxury premium segment, this is our business, but I'm all those things, right? Because I have different jobs to be done. Sometimes I'm trying to wow my boyfriend because it's Valentine's Day and I want to really show off to him. Sometimes I'm going to Paris very quickly to check in with my boss, and I'm staying at an Ibis budget. And then the next day, I have my niece and nephew in town, and they want to stay near the Eiffel Tower, so I'm at a Ibis Styles, or I'm at a Sofitel. That it's better, I think, to think about the jobs to be done and how the brands answer the jobs to be done than looking at kind of generic segments of travelers and saying these are the brands for this traveler, because the traveler is very multifaceted. So I think the way to think about it is through those jobs to be done and then align the brands within a portfolio. Like James said, the total Marriott portfolio is huge, the total Accor portfolio is huge. But again, it's trying to address those jobs to be done, not just segment.
So I'm coming back to now the purpose of the brand. What is the purpose of the brand? It is to drive selection and it is to drive rate. And let's face it, we can talk about brand love and relationships and engagement with the brand and deep and meaningful life. It doesn't really matter. All you're trying to do is get your brand chosen more and drive your price. And if your brand is doing those two things, then it's doing a good job. And if it isn't, then it isn't. And it's pretty simple, really. We saw some great slides in the last session, and I'm looking forward to sort of diving through that pack in detail, where we looked at evolution of ADR and we looked at the headline price and how that's been growing or not. Hotel pricing is a really complex recipe, and one thing that actually does get lost when you look at the rate just in pure rate terms is the impact that different things have on it. So we saw the impact of the Paris Olympics, seasonality, events. They have a huge impact on the price of a hotel, as does supply, as does scarcity, as does, in fact, the sample when you're comparing two periods to another. So too does revenue management, the skill or otherwise of the revenue management function, or the sophistication of the AI model that might replace it. All of these things impact hotel price. So if you're looking at top-line prices, you are not necessarily able to understand if it's your brand that's doing a good job, or if it's your operations and your management, or if it's seasonality or just plain luck sometimes. But it is possible. It is possible to isolate ingredients, but you do need to approach it in a rather more sophisticated way than some of the research that we see out there, which is coming back to what Ted said about the say-do gap. If we take sustainability, for instance, if you say to a whole load of people, would you pay more to stay in a sustainable hotel? Quite a lot of them will nod along, yeah, I want to be seen to be that sort of person, and you see these outrageous headlines, 80% would pay more for a sustainable hotel. No, they wouldn't. Not when they get it into context, not when they're spending their own money, not when the job to be done is a quick trip to see your boss. And I've seen your boss. I wouldn't want to spend more than I had to go and meet with him. So it is possible, though, with a slightly different technique to isolate ingredients. And that's what we've done with our brand margin methodology. It was created, 10 years ago now, actually, in consumer goods. We evolved it for hotels. It is not a pricing study. It reports in currency terms, but it is not a pricing study. It is reporting the premium that a brand could command if you strip out all of those other things that I mentioned. So we are deconstructing the recipe here. So all things being equal, how much more, or in some cases less, do we think people would be prepared to pay to stay in an identical room, but just one carrying a different flag? So this is a little bit more sophisticated than just saying, would you pay more? We do it in an indirect way as well. We don't ask, would you pay more, Tim, because you're far too clever to be influenced by brand. But do you think other people might? Are you influenced by advertising, or do you see right through it? Well, okay, well, you're not helping. I need to find a better plant, don't I? A great deal of people will say, I'm not influenced by advertising, I'm not influenced by brand, it's not important to me, as we saw from those slides. But the way they behave and the fact that all of these things happen suggests that it actually is the case. When we run our brand margin study, and we've had pretty consistent results, certainly in the average lines for the past 7 years that we've been doing it, we actually see that brands do add quite a lot of value. So what this chart is showing is the amount that the average economy tier, mid-market, upper full-service, luxury tier brand will add to the intrinsic product, or the portion of its rate that can be accounted for, if you like, by the brand. And we're stripping out seasonality, we're stripping out revenue management, we're stripping out things like that. We're asking it of people who are familiar with brands. Familiarity means different things, but it's people who are broadly aware, they've stayed, some of them, or they know it and they've looked at it. They're answering on behalf of other people. We're using a wisdom of the crowds approach. We do have rankings for individual brands, and I could tell you which brands are at the top and at the bottom, but if I did, I'd have to bill you. What we see, though, is that brands do add quite a lot of value, and masked in here is an interesting dynamic that goes on with some brands being stronger than others. So the top brand in the upper full service tier, it is not Hilton, okay? But the Hilton name adds value elsewhere, in that the top two in the mid-market brand, and if it's not the top in the in mid-market and economy for sure, mid-market, if it's not the top, it's very, very close to the top. They both carry the Hilton name in some way, shape, or form. It is lending its value to its siblings, and it's doing a lot of heavy lifting. And there are other association brands that do the same as well. It's not just Hilton. But that Hilton reassurance creates the mental shortcut, and people assign value to it. And it's how we see in some markets where there isn't even a single flag under a brand like True by Hilton or Motto by Hilton. 20% of people claim to have heard of it. They haven't heard of Motto, they haven't heard of Spark, they've heard of by Hilton, and that brand power is being lent. And some brands are strong enough to carry that, others are not. And it's a really interesting dynamic. The other thing as well that we do layer on top of this, and I haven't charted it, but you can have a brand that adds a very high premium, but is known by a very small number of people. And we layer this data sometimes against the awareness and the familiarity data to come to brand advantage. So while Hilton might not top this particular table, by the time you layer on the level of awareness, of familiarity, and we can look at preference as well as propensity to avoid, you start to get a feel for actually quite what a brand can add in a particular location. We ask about city centre, we ask about metropolitan, I think in some cases we ask about resort as well. So it's all about context, it's all about tools for the job. One of the things we did a few years ago was we started to correlate some of our brand perception statements with our brand margins to see if there was any link between top performing brands, any attributes that they share. And we ask about 44 statements for consumers to associate with brands. So we're really drilling into the top drivers here. So there's divergence between business and leisure travelers in the luxury tier, but by and large, the luxury tier brands that have the highest value add of those that convey opulence for the leisure traveler, a sort of understated luxury for the business traveler who perhaps wants to treat themselves but doesn't want to be seen to be treating themselves on the company dollar, and then staff, the people anticipating every need. They differ by tier, so it's slightly different for your upper full service brands. It then becomes different again for your mid-scale brands, but actually it sort of comes full circle by the time you get back to the economy tier, where the differentiator is those staff interactions. If they're friendly and welcoming staff, it adds a level of premium. So for all the talk of AI and automation and kiosks and all of the stuff we've heard earlier about how we're flooding into this and various geopolitical things that will ensue from us all piling into AI at the expense of jobs, the premium is still added by the experience, even in the brands that you might consider to be more commodity-led. And then across the tiers, the two things that really stand out, those that have a strong guest experience, they tend to do pretty well in brand margin, and those that have distinctive but relevant differentiation. So there are quite a few out there that have differentiation on a number of things, but if that is not relevant, that doesn't really add value to the proposition, not in the minds of consumers at least. And that is, of course, as Ted said earlier, that's actually where a brand exists. It doesn't really live on the balance sheet.
But I think it lives to your question is, if there's not differentiation, then the brands start to lose their meaning. So if we think about that the brand is a mental shortcut to selection, and a brand is a mental shorthand to driving premium value, that only works if the differentiation of the brand, it doesn't have to be the most unique hotel brand in the world, but it does need to stand for something. In my mind, when I think about it, I think good food, I think has a French savoir-faire, always has a swimming pool, has a good gym, whatever those attributes are, real and perceptual. As long as there's relevant differentiation, then this works as a shortcut and it works as a shorthand on value. If the brands are not differentiated, is where I think you're in kind of murkier territory.
Whereas for me, with two young kids, if they've got colouring sheets and wax crayons, then take my money.
I might be there.
So to summarise, the two purposes of a brand, do they drive choice? Do they add value? From us, it's a resounding yes, actually. That's what the data is indicating. Brands do still drive choice. They provide a shortcut for lazy, irrational humans. And by the way, that's all of us. Every single one of us, however much we might deny it. And those factors actually influence our decision, not directly, by communicating things that we say are important, that we say we look out for. And then on the other hand, do brands add value, Ted?
They do, yeah. So I think, a strong guest experience and relevant differentiation, as I just said, are really important strengths that a brand can add so that you can charge up the right premium and attach it to that job to be done. So, again, the average economy tier hotel can add £5 per guest night just by having a brand associated to it that people have in their mind that they associate with some level of service and value. So there's selection is the first point, and driving value would be the second point.
And with 1 minute 40 or so on the clock, and our final slide, I'd say for once we haven't overcooked the pack, Ted. Thank you very much, everybody. We're happy to take any questions.